Welcome to the September podcast episode of Radiology AI. My name is Dania Daye, and I'm the Associate Editor for Social Media for Radiology AI. Today, we are in for a very special treat. We will be interviewing Dr. Kurt Langlotz. Dr. Langlotz is Professor of Radiology and Biomedical Informatics at Stanford and Director of the Center of Artificial Intelligence in Medicine and Imaging, the Amy Center. Amy supports outstanding interdisciplinary AI research that optimizes how clinical images are used to promote health. We are very excited to have you with us today, Dr. Langlotz. Thank you for joining. I will turn it over now to my co-host, Dr. Paul Yee, to start the discussion. Paul?
All right, thanks so much, Dania. And thank you again, Dr. Langlotz, for joining us here on the podcast. So most of our listeners are probably aware of your leadership at Stanford, both with the Amy Center and your involvement with the various informatics societies, whether in RSNA and SIM. But can you tell us a little bit about how you got started working in AI, and was this related to any work that you might have done in school formally?
Yeah, well, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Dania. Again, it's really a pleasure to be here and share some of this with you. Believe it or not, Stanford did not have a computer science undergraduate major when I went to Stanford back in the 70s and 80s. So that turned out to be a little bit of a blessing in disguise. I got a great liberal education, but my workaround was that I majored in a program called human biology, where you get some of the fundamentals of biological and social sciences, and then you can design your own concentration. So I did something a little unusual. I concentrated in computer models of biological systems. So I got to take computational linguistics, cognitive psychology, some computer simulation, and that's where I took my first AI class, and I really fell in love with it there. A lot of my fellow students at the time, even in human biology, were pre-med. And I came from a family, I didn't really have any exposure to what medicine was like other than going to the family doctor. So I decided not to apply to medical school because there was a new program, a new track in the master's program here at Stanford in artificial intelligence. And so I thought that sounded really fun. And the minute I arrived there, they saw, oh, you're a biomedical guy. You have to go see this guy named Ted Shortliff, who was a physician who had designed his own PhD in information science here at Stanford also, and became really one of the first medical school faculty. He was an internist and young faculty member then, and doing some research in AI. And so I connected with him, and he became kind of he was a great mentor to me as a student, and really became a lifelong mentor and friend. And got hooked into his lab, and he was developing a program called Oncosin, which is one of the first AI programs that was ever used in a clinic. It was actually a rule-based system that was helping the oncologists in the Stanford Oncology Clinic to build their chemotherapy plans for patients. So that was kind of a 2-year thing. And then when I was finishing that, Ted was starting a PhD program, was then called Medical Information Science, but became Biomedical Informatics. And so I applied to that as well as to the MD program, became an MD PhD student in informatics at the time. My PhD was also AI related. It was on the relationship between Bayesian decision theoretic reasoning and AI, which was kind of a hot topic then. So anyway, that's how I got started, and the rest is history. I've just loved it ever since.
Yeah, that's a really interesting, set of events. I guess you didn't even think that you would necessarily go into medicine, but kind of brought you there. What led you to radiology once you got to medical school and once you finished your PhD and started thinking about specialties?
That is a little bit simpler. I just liked it. I liked the idea of it. You'd look at an image and it was kind of like solving a crossword puzzle. You had to find all the clues and put everything together so that it all kind of made a coherent whole. And even though I was being advised at the time not to go into radiology because I was working for a guy who was an internist, he wanted me to be an internist, I think. He didn't push hard, but that would have been the natural path for me. A lot of the people who studied computer science who were in medicine at the time were internists. But I just really loved it. I had enjoyed the visual part of it. I enjoyed the fact that we were getting the answers for the other folks in the hospital. And so I just went for it. Paradoxically, my early research really ended up being focused mostly on the radiology report and communication. And not really much about the pixels for a long, long time. And that was partly my background in orientation in graduate school, because that's a lot of what we thought about then.
So shifting gears to today, many of our listeners are definitely aware of Stanford Amy Center, and many are probably interested in starting similar types of initiatives or labs at their own institutions. Can you tell us a little bit about how the Stanford Amy Center began and how it has grown over the past few years?
Sure, sure. So after I graduated from Stanford, I spent 25 years at Penn. I did my training there, joined the faculty. I did take a few years off to run a startup at one point. Penn is a great institution, but they don't have, or didn't at the time, have a formal informatics graduate program. And the computer scientists there were a couple of them that were interested in healthcare here and there, but not really a very strong interest. So my research there was mostly smaller projects. I would enlist the help of residents or medical students or other trainees. Occasionally I'd get an engineering grad student, but I really missed the kind of more foundational research that you could do with graduate students, masters and PhDs that I knew from being a grad student here at Stanford. So that was one of the main reasons I came back. My wife and I met in medical school and matched together, and we're on the Penn faculty together, but we came back together here in 2014. And believe it or not, it was not because of AI. At the time, AI had not really hit radiology when I was looking for the job. I really just wanted to come back and do more foundational informatics research with grad students. But after I got here, in 2015, they had a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Stanford CS Computer Science Department. And I heard a talk from Fei Li, who was on the computer science faculty here. And she had started ImageNet and showed some of the automated captioning work that they were doing. And it just blew me away, because I thought, hey, that's what I do for a living. I look at images, I create text describing what's on those images. And it just, the application to medical imaging seemed really exciting. So we built up a lab in a community with the help. I had many conversations with David Larson, who's my next door neighbor office mate. And he led one of our first deep learning projects on bone age. And, really realized that pretty much anyone dealing with clinical images would be using these new forms of machine learning going forward. So as we built that up, eventually we were actually raising some money from outside, and we're getting feedback that they wanted to see some more institutional commitment. And I shared that with my chair, Sam Gambier, who sadly passed away recently, but at the time, and he recommended that we speak to some of the other department chairs. So we enlisted the help also of the dean and the chairs of medicine and pathology, and got some investment to start the center. And it just really took off. We now have over 100 faculty. We work with the School of Medicine on developing infrastructure to make it very easy for researchers to get their images quickly and to do the compute that needs to be done, the training. We have a seed grant program where we provide small grants. We provide 7 small grants to labs here who are doing programs and developing systems to develop preliminary data for maybe an NIH application, that sort of thing. We have many, many seminars, work in progress, journal club, happy hour, all of those kind of panel discussions. We have one of the really fun things we do is these interdisciplinary boot camps where we invite students and they get course credit, and we have people, faculty, often clinical faculty with great data sets, come to the first day of class and kind of pitch their data sets and their ideas, and the students break up into teams and solve those problems. And that's been a real engine of some of the work that we've done. And the other thing that I'm really proud of is the work that we've done, and this is predominantly Matt Lundgren's work, but the public release of data sets, because we think that's just so important to drive the field forward. So, now we're multiple millions of dollars of sponsored research. We're close to $1 million in gifts and philanthropy, and that all supports the work we do to improve patient care. We have an industrial affiliates program, which, we collaborate quite a bit with various companies that helps us translate our work to the marketplace. We've had several spin-offs, startup companies that have in AI, imaging AI, that have come out of Stanford that you've probably heard about. So it's been actually more than I could have expected. It's just a very rewarding kind of activity for everyone involved, and so we're just really proud of that.
someone looking in from the outside, it's certainly been very exciting just to see how much success has come out of the Amy Center. But maybe taking a step back in 2017, you posted a tweet saying that, quote, radiologists who use AI will replace radiologists who don't. Can you talk about what you meant by that, maybe back then, and how you've started to see this start to come true now in 2020, or maybe even how your viewpoints might have changed 3 years later?
Yeah, so that tweet kind of took on a life of its own. It was just one of those things that came to me one evening, and I didn't think twice about it, and suddenly it just kind of was circulating widely. I think it's popular in part because it has a double meaning. I think some people might think we're talking about Luddite medical imaging professionals, radiologists who refuse to adopt the new technology, and they might be put out of work because they don't. I don't really think that's likely, given that radiologists have led the adoption of new technologies. Starting with ultrasound, CT, MRI, PACS. You go through the list, and we've embraced all of those things. So I think this is we're likely to embrace AI too. The other meaning is I think it promotes the idea that all radiologists eventually will adopt AI, and then they're replace their former selves who weren't using AI. I wrote an opinion piece in the Radiology AI journal a year or so ago entitled "Will AI Replace Radiologists?" And my view is the answer is no. It's not even close. And if you look at the AI industry today, a lot of the applications are quite narrow. They're usually single things, detecting, a nodule in the chest or a hemorrhage in the brain. Maybe there'll be a few clusters of things together, but those things are extremely unlikely to replace radiologists, just because if you're detecting a nodule, well, there are hundreds of other things that might happen in the chest at the same time. So that one thing is not obviously going to replace us. So I think it's important to think about the distinction between what's a great technology, and there's no doubt that these new machine learning methods are incredible technology. I just think back to when I was in training, you'd have someone who would work for 4 or 5 years and get a PhD just to build a system that might, classify images in a productive way. Now with the right training data, you can do it, in a week or a day even. And so and by the way, the accuracy is going to be much better than the accuracy of the systems that we built many years ago. So it's an incredible technology, but I don't think that it's a great business, in the sense that if you look at the business side of it, you really need to have a return on your investment when you buy these things. So I think it's cool if we have algorithms that detect lung nodules, but I'm not going to pay a lot for that. I'll pay some. It's not going to replace me, and it may not end up being a great industry in that sense. But I think that there will be an increasing number of applications that will improve our productivity. And although there are not very many of those applications today, again, I think as we build more and more, just for example, you can imagine if you could detect enough of the abnormalities. Let's just take an ICU chest X-ray, for example. There aren't that many things that regularly happen on those images, and you could imagine building a bunch of AI algorithms that would find different abnormalities and maybe even generate some text and would draft a report. Well, now you've got a kind of a virtual trainee that could speed me up and others up who don't have human residents to help. So that's where you start to see some really interesting ideas in the industry. So anyway, there's no doubt AI is going to transform the way we practice, but I don't think replacement is the right word. It's going to help us interpret larger data sets, help us correlate the data that we have with other, big data, genomics, that kind of thing. We'll be able to extract additional information from images quickly, which we don't normally do. Things like texture, organ volumes, that kind of thing, very quickly. And probably new uses for imaging that will tend to increase the volume of some studies, because we'll have new ways to detect abnormalities, and that may counteract any productivity effects. So we shall see. Very interesting question.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree that there's tremendous potential for AI for all of the different things that you've mentioned. But I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on how to bridge the gap between proofs of concept, which we have a lot of in the literature, we have a lot of exciting things being presented and even being spun out by different companies, But how do we bridge that gap between being proof of concept to being something that's actually going to be viable, either from a financial standpoint or a clinical standpoint? Because when I think about it, there still seems to be this chasm in between there. And I'm curious to see what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that is definitely a challenge. And it relates to the fact that these models, machine learning models, are not particularly generalizable. So if you train on a narrow data set, it works on that data set, but how well will it work on a new data set? That may have a shift in the domain, or maybe there's just a new device in the same setting. So all of those things, I think, are slowing the translation. I think that's an appropriate and good thing, that we need to, just as we do with any other new intervention in healthcare where the risks are there, we need to assure ourselves that the model is doing what it should do, and in fact put in place governance processes. So how do we know when a model is ready for a prospective evaluation on real patients? How do we track a model over time? So monitor it to make sure that it's behaving the same on day 100 that it was on day 1. I think all of those are, in addition to the industry difficulties I mentioned, I think those are really important that we think a lot about in the Amy Center as to how we can very deliberately and prudently translate the work that we're doing into the clinical setting and get it out to the point where it can help patients, but do that very deliberately. So I think those are some of the issues we think about.
So speaking of safety, one topic that's been under a lot of discussion, both within radiology as well as perhaps the tech world, has been reimbursement models for AI vendors, radiology and healthcare. And up until pretty recently, this has been largely theoretical. But as many of our listeners probably have heard, the CMS recently approved reimbursements for the use of the VizAI stroke detection AI software, which is based on deep learning. And it's essentially a mobile phone app to detect large vessel occlusions. So I'm curious what you think about this watershed event and its implications for the future of AI and radiology. Maybe it's a lot of hype, maybe it's not, but I can't think of anyone who might have a better handle on that than you.
Yeah, I have to say that was like a lightning bolt. I was stunned. I tweeted, wow, I honestly did not think this was going to happen. But I mean, and so why wasn't it going to happen? Well, two reasons. One, I think breast CAD, which was now maybe 15, 20 years ago, was a cautionary tale where we had a new technology and there was a big legislative push. Wow, this seems to be really great and it's helping radiologists be more accurate and everybody should have it. And so Congress decided there would be extra reimbursement for the use of this technology. And of course, then everyone bought it, because why not? If you're going to get that extra few dollars per mammogram, you should have this technology available. And people had no reason to think it wouldn't help. But if you look at some of the most recent research on it, it's pretty clear now that I don't think it did any harm, but it didn't really help much either in the real world. So that's an interesting thought, that maybe we need to collect a little more information, a little more data about how these algorithms work in the real world before we put a lot of reimbursement behind it. So that was one kind of cautionary tale. The other is just, you look at the environment for reimbursement for what physicians do, and there's really no appetite for more, additional codes, additional money. So anyway, those are the reasons why it surprised me. It is interesting, if you read through the CMS documents for that approval, there's a whole almost a Socratic dialogue, between the company and CMS, which is laid out pretty clearly there. And CMS was very much laser focused on the return on investment. So, how much money are we saving by getting the patient to an interventional procedure for their stroke? So just, I think you mentioned it, but this is about large vessel occlusion and detecting those and then immediately alerting the interventionalist who's going to take the clot out. And the quicker you can do that, of course, the more brain you save. So they had very good data, published some of it, that showed that the time to intervention was significantly decreased. They even had some data on outcomes of these patients. So I think, I do understand, but I think people have misinterpreted the number too. So that it really is, I think what CMS actually approved was $25,000 per year, regardless of the number of patients you do in that year. So a major stroke center who might do, a large number of 100 patients, let's say, they're going to get whatever the math is, 25,000 divided by 100, 250, whereas a site that only does 25 patients would get 1,000. And I think that was kind of their maximum. So at any rate, it's a really interesting area. I think the problem comes, and this is just always true, policy decisions are so hard. Like, do you really want to be paying for this if a site already has a great program that's extremely fast and they have other ways of alerting these physicians to do this well? The other is, well, are there programs where they would purchase this software because they want to get the reimbursement for it, but they wouldn't necessarily use it optimally so that it in fact gets the same time savings that they showed in the literature? So those are always really hard things to predict in the real world. So that's very interesting. And then the other thing I'll mention is just kind of related is there's also a proposed rule from CMS, and this is for any device that is considered a breakthrough device. So not based on any other previous devices, but something new, as this one was. And if that's the case, they're proposing that that device would automatically get reimbursed by CMS for 4 years. And the idea is that 4 years would be available optionally for the company to develop evidence that it has a positive effect. So that's a very interesting set of developments, and I think it's going to bode well for the radiology AI and imaging AI industry generally, particularly for developing those applications that are likely to have an ROI.
That all sounds really interesting, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it all unfolds. Switching gears to another current event, the COVID-19 pandemic has found a lot of researchers, both in academia and in industry alike, focusing efforts to develop algorithms that can diagnose COVID-19 on chest radiographs, CT, and other imaging modalities. In an effort to increase the amount of data available for these efforts, you've recently led a multi-institutional and multi-society effort to create open source imaging data sets for AI models for COVID-19. Could you speak a little bit about how this came about and what the current state is of the initiative?
Yes, thank you. We call it MIDRIC, which is the Medical Imaging and Data Resource Center. And there's a tremendous need, just stepping back for a minute, a tremendous need for large AI-ready databases. I've talked a lot about Medical ImageNet, which would be the analog to ImageNet, and that's just driven the progress in computer vision for so many years. And I think we need something equivalent in medicine. Amy Center, we've led the way in data releases, as I've said, but we really need more. We need more data diversity. So starting back in, I think, early 2019, I and others were involved with helping the NIBIB plan for perhaps supporting such large databases, and they were interested. And so we had been meeting, so in late 2019, we had a meeting and talked about what would be the right use cases for such a thing. And then, of course, COVID came, and that became an obvious choice for the first use case for this kind of large database. Because if you look at the COVID models that have been built, there's been a couple of nice reviews on this. The current models tend to be small, homogeneous data sets, but there are lots of questions to answer about COVID, and particularly when you start thinking about how you would combine imaging data with other forms of data. So early on in the pandemic, the NIBIB asked 3 organizations, RSNA, the AAPM, and the ACR, to come together to write a white paper on what a COVID imaging database and a related research effort might look like. And I was fortunate enough to serve as the RSNA representative on the writing group for that. And that resulted in a contract that supports a national repository of images as well as associated research projects. So there are 5 what they call technology development projects, which dovetail with what ACR, RSNA, and AAPM are already doing. So RSNA has an existing program called RECORD, which is our COVID data collection efforts. And we've already collected over 7,000 cases, and we'll be making them public very soon. And those two efforts are really going to merge. Has been led by Matt Lundgren, who'll be a part of the MIDRIC effort as well. And so those technology development are really infrastructure projects that'll help us work together as groups to create this large integrated archive. And then there are 12 research projects that will take advantage of the data that's been collected, typically developing AI algorithms for COVID, that sort of thing. And then I would expect, I don't know, but the NIBIB will probably have other announcements about funding opportunities that would take advantage of the data that's being produced. So this was just funded about a month ago. We're just getting started, but you'll be hearing a lot more about it. It's very exciting, and I think it's important work because of so many unanswered questions about COVID images.
That all sounds incredibly exciting, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it all turns out. As we move into the last few minutes of our time together, we wanted to take a moment to ask some advice from you for those who might want to follow in similar footsteps as yourself. So for radiologists, both in practice and in training, do you have any advice for those who would like to learn more about AI and get more involved with AI?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, I just finished a 4-month sabbatical where I spent some time refreshing my own skills. So I had a chance to survey some of the great options that are out there, and I'm obviously aware of some of the others that are offered by RSNA and other places. The answer depends a little bit on your background, your career stage, what goals you have. Are you a trainee or just a radiologist who wants to know the basics as a user of AI, or do you want to become a practice leader for AI for your practice, or do you actually want to develop some of these technologies? So I think a little bit different answers, but I can give you some of the lay of the land. So first of all, I'll just say that I think that radiologists have led the way in new disciplines like MR because we've learned the physics, and we learned a little bit about how it works and how it doesn't work, what the artifacts look like, the failure modes, that kind of thing. And I think that we'll need to incorporate some AI into radiology training for that same reason, that we're going to be working in tandem with these systems, and we're going to have to understand what the limitations are so that we can know when to believe the system and when we want to maybe take a second look. But in terms of getting some basic training, there obviously are some really great hands-on courses at RSNA. You can take 90 minutes and sit down and bring your laptop and actually by the end of that time have trained a model to recognize something on an image. There are many other refresher courses and webinars and so on. A good place to start that I often recommend for any physician is a course on Coursera called AI for Everyone, taught by Andrew Ng. It's the first in a sequence of courses, but that gives you just a really good overview. And then you can continue with the sequence if you wish. And then you can really, if you want to really get into it, he's got a sequence of courses that's much more technical and math heavy, but that's, for those who are interested. The other thing that I think is important is that AI is really, you want to learn about AI, but in order to do so, you probably need some grounding in informatics. So there's something called the National Imaging Informatics course, and NIIC, which is offered to residencies. It's a week-long course sponsored by RSNA and SIM, and that's a good way to get some grounding too. And you don't have to be a resident to take it either. You can just sign up otherwise. And then, if you really want to get intense about it, obviously there are degree programs, and you can learn how to program and do software development. And if you have even just a little bit of coding knowledge, I really recommend the Fast AI set of videos from Jeremy Howard. And there are some online workbooks. They're called Jupyter Notebooks, where you can actually work through the code that he uses. And so the difference between that and some of the other courses is some of the Coursera work, it's bottom up, right? You start with a lot of the notation, you finally build up to what a big deep learning model looks like. In Fast AI, on the first day, here are 5 lines of code that trains an AI algorithm, and we're going to build something that recognizes dogs and cats. And then over time, you learn about what all the different parameters mean and some of the details that are underneath. So I found that for me, who, I'm a coder, I know several computer languages, that was great for me. And then there's actually a new book out that if you prefer to consume it in that way, you could read the book. So those are just some of the ways that I would suggest people get started.
All right. And as a final closing question that we ask all of our guests, what are you most excited about in the next decade in radiology, AI, or informatics, or anything else?
Well, I'll tell you, this maybe doesn't fall into the category of excitement, but something that I think is really important and interesting is the issue of bias. And that's something that people are thinking a lot more about now than they did before, and rightly so. And it's more than just biased data sets. You know, sometimes we think about, well, the data set doesn't fully represent the population, and so the algorithm is going to have certain biases in it. And yes, that's important, but it also has to do with the whole context in which we're working. So what questions are we asking? I just heard a really interesting talk from a fellow named David Jones from Harvard, who's done a lot of work in this area. He had a paper in the New England Journal with a table of the various algorithms and how they might incorporate prediction algorithms and how bias might be incorporated. And he said he was approached by someone and they had built an algorithm for predicting deep vein thrombosis, DVT risk. And it showed that the risk was higher in African Americans than in non-African Americans. And he was asked, well, should we implement this algorithm? And he said it depends on the context. So why is it? It bears some additional investigation. Why is that difference? Why does it exist? Is it a genetic difference? Then you might say, yeah, that you should consider that in your algorithm. Or is it the way that the patients are being treated by the nursing staff, that some are getting up out of bed sooner than others, in which case, just encoding that or making it persist as part of an algorithm, that's an important problem that should be dealt with in another way. So I think, and in particular in deep learning, I think we have a special obligation due to the more opaque nature of the reasoning of our system. So, in that case, maybe there was a regression equation and there was a factor that said, race and 0.83 or whatever it is. You wouldn't necessarily see that in a deep learning algorithm. It would all be implicit in the neural network. So we have a lot of work to do, consider how to counteract those issues. So anyway, that's one important one. But the one I'll end on is kind of a positive, and that just has to do with collaboration. And maybe this is more personal to me, but I just find it really fun and interesting to see people who are incredible experts in their own domains. So, we interact with incredibly talented computer scientists, and of course, obviously, amazing experts in clinical medicine. And it's so fun to see each of those groups or individuals approach a problem with some humility about the fact that their skills, yes, they may be amazing, but they really can't solve that problem without the help of the other. And to see those collaborative groups form and work together and build these incredible tools is just very gratifying to me. And that's one of the reasons we started the center and kind of one of the key tenets of the center. So those are some of the things I'm excited about for the future.
All right. Well, thank you again, Dr. Langlotz, for your time, your experiences, and your wisdom. With that,
thank you for everything you're doing with this podcast and all the other ways you and Dania are working to make the Radiology AI Journal the success that it has become. So thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
We appreciate it. Likewise. So Dania, I'll give it back to you.
So thank you, Paul and Dr. Langlotz, for a really great discussion. And Dr. Langlotz, thank you for sharing with us how you got started in the field, your vision for the future of AI, and really also for giving us tips and advice about how to get started in the field and how to succeed moving forward. Before we end, I wanted to put a plug for the upcoming RSNA annual meeting. RSNA 2020 is coming to you. As you all know, we invite you to take part in this year's all-virtual event happening November 29th through December 5th. RSNA is committed to providing the same outstanding programming you've all come to expect in a variety of digital formats. All RSNA members get free premium access to RSNA 2020, which includes CME opportunities, on-demand programming, and extended access to meeting content through April 2021. Non-members can also register at a special rate until October 1st. Register today at rsna.org/annual-meeting. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in to the September podcast episode. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to our Radiology AI podcast series on any of iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. Stay tuned for our next episode.